The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, anti-poverty advocate Arohi Pathak on why a stimulus measure to cut child poverty should be made permanent. Economist Daron Acemoglu on redesigning artificial intelligence in the interest of workers. And Bill Press with Edward-Isaac Dovere, author of Battle for the Soul, Inside the Democrats' Campaigns to Defeat Trump. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. An expanded child tax credit signed into law in March is set to expire at the end of the year. Arohi Pathak explains why making it permanent can lead to a transformational change in how our nation confronts child poverty. And we say hello to Arohi Pathak, who's the Director of Policy for the Poverty to Prosperity Program at American Progress. Arohi, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. Now, we're going to talk about the expanded child tax credit, which is part of the American Rescue Plan. But before we get to that, what do you want our listeners to know about the state of child poverty in America and how it's changed since the pandemic began?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So the U.S. is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and yet poverty, and particularly child poverty in this country, is stubbornly high. There's nearly 12 million kids in the U.S. that live below the federal poverty line, and 2 out of 3 of those children that are living in poverty are children of color. The one thing that I want to stress here is that poverty in the U.S. is not a personal choice. It's a policy choice. For too many years, policymakers have failed to invest in the kinds of programs and policies that are designed to prevent and reduce poverty. And because of these policy choices, when the pandemic hit last year, the impact on the health and well-being of poor families and children was drastic. Just to give you some sense of that, at the pandemic's peak in April 2020, more than 21% of kids had at least one parent who was unemployed. Around 25% of kids lived in families that were struggling to meet their basic needs, and up to 11 million kids lived in food insecure households. So what the pandemic really did was to highlight the inequities that already existed in our country, laying bare the impact on our most vulnerable populations.
Mm-hmm. Now, the expanded child tax credit is aimed at reducing child poverty, and it goes into effect in July. In terms of who is eligible and how much they'll receive, what changes in July?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, so bear with me, Jim. So thanks to the Biden administration's American Rescue Plan, starting on July 15th, the IRS will start making some direct monthly payments to low-income parents with children. Parents will receive as much as $300 per month for kids under the age of 6 and $250 per month for kids under or between the ages of 6 and 17. Parents will get these monthly payments through to the end of the year, so that will be December 2021. And families will claim the remainder of the credit when they file their 2021 taxes in April of next year. In terms of eligibility, the tax credit is phased out for those who have an income of over $112,000 for single parents, and those that make over $150,000 for married couples. And most families will see the funds directly deposited into the same account that the IRS used for their tax refund. And for folks that did not stipulate a direct deposit account, they'll either receive a paper check or a debit card with the funds preloaded onto it.
Now, the expanded credit also makes payments available on a monthly basis as opposed to a year, one a year rather. Why is that so important?
This is important because monthly installments of the child tax credit provides a really reliable source of income for parents. It helps them meet their it helps them meet their immediate needs. It helps them plan for the future, and it makes them more financially stable on a day-to-day basis. The monthly benefit will also boost the economy because parents basically will spend their cash assistance on basic necessities like food or childcare or housing. And then the final thing here is that the monthly benefit also puts the tax credit much more in line with other popular benefits that help families meet their basic needs, such as the Social Security payments or food stamps.
Now, Arohi, in terms of reducing child poverty in general in the United States, what kind of impact are you expecting to see from this expansion?
So the child tax credit is an anti-poverty program. It always has been. An estimated 39 million households, which is home to nearly 90% of all the kids in the US, are expected to receive these benefits. The temporary expansion of the child tax credit just in 2021, and this is through the American Rescue Plan, this would reduce child poverty in the US by 45% and lift almost 5 million kids out of poverty. It will also disproportionately benefit Black and Latino households. But it's really important to note that the impact of this policy really will depend on its implementation. Given that the tax credit is refundable, it means that families who typically don't file taxes because their income is too low, they will receive this credit for the first time. So it's really important that we get the information about this credit to those families that are newly eligible so that they can take the action they need to receive the money that they're entitled to. So without adequate outreach to these families, the tax credit will not reach the most vulnerable. So implementation really is going to matter in this instance.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Arohi Pathak, who's Director of Policy for the Poverty to Prosperity Program at American Progress. And Arohi, your colleagues at the Center for American Progress have noted there is also potential to reduce our nation's racial wealth gap with an expanded child tax credit. How do you see that happening?
So reforming and modernizing policies like the child tax credit, they can absolutely reduce the racial wealth gap. As I mentioned earlier, poverty is a result of policy decisions. So when the tax credit was originally designed in 1997, it likely contributed to the racial wealth gap in this country because it excluded the poorest families that did not make enough to pay taxes. And most of those families are people of color. Then in 2017, the Trump administration passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which required children to have a Social Security number in order to receive eligible benefits. And because of this, an estimated 1 million kids were made ineligible for the credit. So right now, Congress has an opportunity to roll back both the Trump exclusions, but also to make this tax credit permanent. And that will ensure that the tax credit reaches all kids, but especially children of color. And that's one policy decision that can significantly reduce the racial wealth gap in this country.
That's almost a punishment to the children for doing nothing. I mean, it's just it's so horrible to hear you describe the previous administration's whole take on this thing. It's just well, so much of that administration was disturbing, but onward we go. The Center for American Progress has taken the position that this expansion, which expires at the end of the year, as you pointed out, should be made permanent. And one of your arguments is that it's an important public investment. How do you make that case?
Sure. So one thing to understand is in the last 4 years, between 2016 and 2020, total federal spending on children has fallen by almost 9%. Now, we have a ton of research that shows that investment in children, especially under the age of 6, results in long-term positive benefits. For example, income support programs like the child tax credit and also the earned income tax credit have significantly led to improved infant and maternal health outcomes, and they've also boosted the educational health and employment potential of future generations. By some estimates, investing in the child tax credit in its current expanded form would generate about $800 billion in benefits to society as a whole. And so what we're seeing in the past year is the results of the economic stimulus and the federal investment in safety nets that the federal government has made over this last year has really lifted people out of poverty or helped them really weather the pandemic. And this is a really compelling argument for more aggressive and continued government support to reduce poverty and especially child poverty.
Mm-hmm. And Arohi, what's your sense now of the politics on this issue? I mean, is a permanent expanded child tax credit something the Biden administration could actually get through Congress?
That's an interesting question. There's certainly a lot of momentum to make the child care tax credit permanent right now. The American Families Plan, which is proposed by the Biden administration, would extend the enhanced benefit through 2025. There's also a lot of Democrats, as well as a lot of coalition partners, including the Center for American Progress, that are really pushing to make the expanded credit and the monthly payments a permanent benefit. So, right now we have an opportunity to keep the pressure going. Reducing child poverty is one of the smartest investments that we can make as a country. We know that the tax credit is an effective tool to doing this, and we need to keep up all kinds of pressure to make this into a permanent benefit that follows all kids in the U.S. and not just those whose parents pay taxes.
Mm-hmm. It all seems pretty obvious to me, and I think probably to a lot of other people. And it's kind of crazy that we're having to kind of pull and tug and fight to get this to occur. And I just hope that your work is not ignored, and that the fight continues, and we start doing the right things.
Thank you, Jim. We just need public will to do that, but we will continue fighting to make sure that happens.
Fantastic. Arohi Pathak, Director of Policy for the Poverty to Prosperity Program at American Progress, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Arohi, thank you so much for your time with us. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, changing the script on what artificial intelligence means for workers. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
When Donald Trump declared he would fix the U.S. Postal Service, he was using the word fix the same way veterinarians do when you bring in your dog. Trump wasted an inordinate amount of his presidential power and prestige in a failed attempt to neuter an agency that literally delivers for the people. Extraordinary postal workers move our letters and packages by truck, car, airplane, boat, motorbike, mule, and of course by foot, to any address across town or across the country. Both essential and effective, it's the most popular federal agency, with 91% of the public approving its work. Thus, an uproar of protest killed Trump's attempt to gut it. When it comes to bad public policy, however, failure is just a way of saying, let's try the back door. Trump was defeated, but he left behind an undistinguished postmaster general named Louis DeJoy, who had only 2 qualifications for the job. He was a Trump mega-donor, and he was a peer of corporate powers that have long wanted to privatize the Postal Service. In March, before the new Biden presidency had taken charge of the postal system, DeJoy popped through the back door with his own 10-year plan to fix the agency. Rhetorically, his plan promised to, quote, achieve service excellence by making mail delivery more consistent and reliable. How? By consistently cutting service and reliably gouging customers. Specifically, DeJoy proposed to close numerous mail processing facilities, eliminate jobs, reduce post office hours of service, and cut the standard of delivering our first-class mail from 3 days to 5. Oh, also raise stamp prices. This is Jim Hightower saying delivering lousy service at higher prices is intended to destroy public support, opening up the service to takeover by private profiteers. And who gets joy from that? The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by our new Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. With kick-ass political spark plugs like Beto O'Rourke, musical champions like Marcia Ball, and grassroots change makers like the New Georgia Project and People's Action, the Lowdown Happy Hour is reaching out to you to help put the move in movement. So grab a libation and join the fun. Details at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Artificial intelligence is already making a profound impact on the lives of American workers. Daron Acemoglu says the choices we make now will determine whether AI deepens inequality or leads to shared prosperity. And we say hello to Daron Acemoglu, an MIT Institute professor and a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's also the author of numerous books and co-author of Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor. And most recently, he is the editor of the new book, Redesigning AI. Daron Acemoglu, thank you very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. And your newest book, as I mentioned, is about artificial intelligence and the threats it may pose to work, democracy, and justice. In terms of the scope of the book, what's covered under the heading of AI?
I think, AI is the name given to the suite of technologies that are sort of more autonomous and intelligent. In their current rendition, they heavily rely on big data, machine learning type of techniques. And they are spreading very rapidly in all advanced economies right now, and including China. And really the focus that I think is most important in this context is what AI will do to jobs, inequality, labor market, and what it will do to democracy and governance. I think those two are separate but interlocked themes.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's speak to the issue of work and economic inequality. What are some of the more significant threats?
Well, if you look at the evolution of the U.S. labor market over the last 30 years, it's been really unusual and quite troublesome. We've had an enormous shift against labor. The labor share of national income used to hover above 2/3. Over the last 20 years, it has fallen by 10 percentage points. It's now like in the low 50s. Wages have stagnated. Median wages have stagnated. Inequality has increased tremendously, really at breakneck speed. And even more importantly, for its social consequences, we've seen the real earnings of low education men fall significantly. So if you are today a high school graduate or high school dropout man, you are almost surely earning much less than your parents did or your father did. So these are not caused by AI. AI technologies have really taken off over the last 3 or 4 years. But they are intimately connected to automation, how we are using technologies, how we are changing the balance between capital and labor in the workplace. And AI, as it is currently developing, looks set to deepen these trends, exacerbate the problems. So it looks like AI is going to go more and more in the direction of automation. It doesn't need to. That's why redesigning and redirecting AI is a topic that we have to pay attention. AI is a very versatile technology. It's really like an amazing broad platform. But right now, under the influence of big tech companies whose business model is focused on automation, it's going more and more in this direction of trying to replicate the things that humans do.
Well, Daron, it's interesting. The way you start off the book, it's with a very important point, which is that these threats are not inevitable. And that's a point you made before Congress last September, where you testified that excessive automation is a result of choices, and we can make different choices. I actually have a background in radio and saw a lot of people lose their jobs because of automation. I guess you could call that the early stages of AI. In terms of government policy, what are some of the choices being made that we should really be concerned about?
Well, thanks for bringing that up, Jim. I think that's really important. If you read books written on this topic, they have titles like What Technology Wants, Inevitable, the oncoming technology revolution. They give this impression that A, there is some preordained path of technology, and B, that we should just trust the experts on how we should use technology, especially digital and AI technologies. I think nothing could be farther from the truth. Every time there is a technological choice, it's a choice from many, many different possibilities. How we use technologies, who benefits from it, what types of advances we go after, all of those are decisions that we make at the societal level. And it's not just government policy. I think you are right to emphasize government policy because that's the one that's really been lacking in its leadership. But it's the decisions that companies make. Companies in the US, big tech, have been making some very specific type of decisions. And it's also a choice that society makes. Look at electric cars. Why have they advanced so rapidly over the last decade or so? Because consumers have put pressure on companies that, say we don't want technologies with a very heavy carbon footprint. So I think it's a choice that companies have to make, but consumers, civil society have to play a much bigger role than they are playing right now. And I think they are being lulled into a false sense of security and false sense of optimism with, what they hear from AI leaders, and the government has to play a leadership role.
So Daron, you brought up the electric car, and consumers are putting the pressure on the companies. Look, we don't want to have the carbon footprint, but I kind of get a sense that there might be a chicken and egg sort of thing here. Are the technology companies shaping our demands, or are demands shaping the technology companies?
I think they're both taking place. But that dialectic, that feedback process could work for our benefit or our detriment. Look, if you, perhaps electric cars is a little bit more niche, but if you look at the situation of energy production in 1980s, there's no way you could have tried to decarbonize the economy by going into renewable energy. Renewable energy was way too expensive. And I think sure, companies did play some leadership role, but it was mostly government subsidies to solar and wind and hydrocarbon and hydroelectric, sorry, and also consumers, again, civil society putting pressure on these things. So I do think that leadership coming from government and from society is important, cannot be ignored.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Daron Acemoglu, who's an MIT Institute professor, research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and of course, author of numerous books, co-author of Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor. And most recently, and the topic of our discussion today, he's the editor of the new book, Redesigning AI. So we're talking technology companies. What are they doing to kind of raise that threat level?
Well, look, I think companies are going to go after their profits, especially in the current environment, because we've created a sort of an ecosystem where shareholder values rule supreme, and many companies are not very responsible to their broader stakeholders, including their workers. And also they're going to have their own vision. We celebrate, partly rightly, partly a little bit exaggeratedly, but we celebrate in the United States visionary leaders like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. So every company has their own vision. And if you look at what's the vision of Amazon, what's the vision of Google, what's the vision of Facebook, they are technology companies targeted at using algorithms for more and more tasks and automating and creating an algorithm-based system of production and service delivery. And they have new ways of monetizing things through ads and engagement, for example, for Facebook and Google. It's the job of society and the government to also push them in a different direction. It's fine for a company to say, I have a vision and everything's going to be automated. That's fine if just one company does that. But when the whole future of technology is beholden to that vision, then we are in trouble, especially because, if we automate everything, where are the middle-class jobs going to come from? Are we going to create a two-tier society where 60, 70% of Americans are not going to have any meaningful jobs? They're going to be dependent on handouts from philanthropic organizations or from government. They're not going to have any high social status, career building opportunities, sort of purposeful, meaningful activities in the labor market. I think that's a very dystopian future.
And that is scary to think about. And the fact that it's not that far from reality or potential reality is mind-boggling. And Daron, in your writing, you not only argue that the threats of AI are not inevitable, but that different choices can create a situation where AI actually contributes to a more inclusive prosperity.
Of course, yes.
So what is your vision of how that can happen?
Well, look, again, AI is such a broad platform. We can do so many things with AI. Let me give you one example just to make things specific. Education. What do you think the use of AI in education would look like? Well, if you think about it, there are two very different visions there. One is closer to reality. We're going to use AI to perform more and more of the tasks that teachers used to perform. So grading tests, doing some of the teaching, giving feedback to student homework. That would be the automation use of AI. But imagine that we use AI for something completely different. For example, there is a lot of evidence from social psychology and education research that different students have different learning styles. They find different parts of the curriculum difficult. It's a very dynamic process. It depends on how a given material is presented to them. So we can use AI to collect real-time information and find out where students are having difficulty. And we have more teachers, more skilled teachers that involve much more in teaching according to the needs of the students. In that case, AI would be a labor complementary technology. It will actually boost the demand for skilled teachers. But of course, which one do you think is closer to reality? I would say the latter, because first of all, the latter is much more, the former, the one where we replace teachers, because it's much closer to the business model of the leading tech companies. And moreover, to have the second model, we would need more skilled teachers and spend much more on those teachers. Who's going to do that? Nobody is willing to do that. So this it sort of emphasizes that we need many complementary steps to go to this next level of using AI for something much more human complementary, for something that's much closer to building a new middle class set of occupations.
It seems to me that way of thinking where we'll ultimately replace everything with AI, people have blinders on. They're looking, they have this narrow focus of what the world could actually be. And not only that, no economy would ever last that way. As you already pointed out, if 60% of the people can't work because everything's being done for them, how are they going to live? That's
right. Look,
nuts.
I think that's exactly the case. And James Robinson and I did a lot of research on historical institutions and long-run development inequality. Thanks for mentioning Why Nations Fail. And Why Nations Fail, we talk of these extractive institutions which monopolize opportunity and means of enrichment in the hands of a very small group. And then historically, the way that we describe it in that book is it's a very narrow elite, like in Imperial China or the Ottoman Empire or feudal Europe or slavery, where it's a repressive elite that kind of monopolizes the means of coercion, and it's via that channel that you create this sort of two-tiered society. The US is unlikely to look like that, but we are looking more and more like a two-tiered society. There's a group of workers, managers, entrepreneurs with very specialized skills. They have very high status jobs. They make important decisions. They have many meaningful jobs. They're earning a lot. And more Americans are in low status, more dependent on sort of handouts, and they are no longer, they're in sort of 0-hour contracts or contingent gig jobs. They don't have those career opportunities. So I think that's going to be the modern extractive society, and it's going to be as disruptive to our prosperity and shared prosperity as the historical extractive societies would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, many people refer to the time that we're living right now as a gig economy. So it's already well on its way. And Daron, before we let you go, and you've said, the choices have to be made to make inclusive prosperity happen. Do you sense there's enough interest both among lawmakers and tech CEOs to do that? I mean, if not, how? I mean, or how can we push them in that direction if they're not really, if they don't have that vision?
Well, you're asking me the question that, in the 1980s, the equivalent would be, is there much enthusiasm among big oil executives for a green future? And I think the answer then was no. But look at it today. It's hardly a day goes by without me hearing an ad on the radio or podcast saying ExxonMobil and Chevron are committed to green energy. How did we come here? Is that because they became enlightened? Well, it's really because they are under pressure. So I think it's our job to put pressure on them. And lawmakers, look, I think lawmakers are very pliable. We are giving them incentives to deal with short-term problems, and they're dealing with short-term problems. I think we need to give them incentives and put pressure on them to actually tackle these medium-term questions as well.
Fascinating stuff. The book, Redesigning AI, Daron Acemoglu is our guest today, and he is the editor of this book, Redesigning AI. Of course, he's an MIT Institute professor and a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Daron, we don't have enough time to talk about this topic properly. We would love to have you back and do more on this again soon.
Thank you, Jim. I would love to come back.
Fantastic. Thank you for your time. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press with journalist and author Edward-Isaac Dovere on his new book, Battle for the Soul, Inside the Democrats' Campaigns to Defeat Trump.
The grand jury in New York has been convened to look into criminal allegations against Donald Trump. What do you think this means for Donald Trump, and what do you think it means about the Republican decision to stick with Donald Trump in 2022 and maybe 2024?
Look, everybody who is talking about this grand jury situation and what might be part of it, what might not be, is guessing when it comes to the legal part of it. I think that what is definitely true is that it's not good news to have a grand jury impaneled, right? It's not like good for Trump. It might be nothing for Trump in the end if the grand jury doesn't have charges that come out of it. But it's not going to be something that turns out well for him, except if he turns that into, they impaneled the grand jury and got nothing, if that is indeed what happens. I think what you see with the Republican Party overall is this really difficult process that they're going through, trying to figure out what to do about Donald Trump. In some ways, it was really captured to me the best by Lindsey Graham, whose own went from saying in 2015, if we have Trump as the Republican nominee, we'll lose and we'll deserve to, and was very anti-Trump, to then becoming as close to Trump as he could get, to then the hours after the riot saying on the Senate floor, enough is enough. We need to move forward, to then the comment that I'm building up to here, which is that he was talking about Trump, and he said, look, I don't think that there's a future for the Republican Party without Trump. And what he's getting at is that it's a very difficult thing for Republicans here. They know that Trump is a weight on them in a lot of ways, that he turns off a lot of voters, that's true even more so after the pandemic, after the riot. But he also turns on a lot of voters, and a lot of voters who will only turn on for him. And you look at the results in 2016 and 2018, 2020, the one that the Republicans did the worst in was 2018 because he wasn't on the ballot. Mm-hmm. And that is now a big question. So 2022, whatever happens, he won't be on the ballot. And can the Republican Party figure out some way to thread this needle of not really being Trump not being there, but being for Trump, of not really, at least so far, having an agenda, it seems, other than saying that Trump is great and that the Democrats are terrible and socialists. If that's the whole argument, it might work, but it's certainly not the grand ideology that you've seen from Republicans in years past.
A related issue is what to do about the January 6th commission. As we know, originally everybody was for it. Everybody, Republican, Democrats, so we got to look into this and find out how this happened and how these people would take over the Capitol, one of the most tightly guarded buildings in the world. And then McCarthy and McConnell came out against it. And again, looking at 2022, Republicans are split. Mitt Romney saying, we're going to look terrible if we don't let the truth come out. And McConnell saying, we're going to look terrible if we're still talking about January 6th. Are the Republicans playing this right?
I mean, they're making McConnell's decision is pretty transparently, as is Kevin McCarthy's, a political one. They think it'll be worse for the midterms next year. I don't think that they're making an argument or would pretend to be making an argument that's about what's good for the country. They haven't even, I think there are a lot of people who would like to know more about what happened there, but they're also looking at a situation where, look, would Democrats try to make as much hay out of what happened as possible? Yes. Politically, of course they would. But there are things that we don't know about what happened that day. The biggest one is what Trump's role was, what Trump was sort of doing minute by minute there. And as other people have pointed out, and Liz Cheney has said would probably be a problem, is that Kevin McCarthy, who was on the phone a couple of times with Trump on the day of the riot, could be subpoenaed. And he might have to answer for what he was hearing out of the president, which it seems like, based on what other accounts we have so far, was not Donald Trump sitting there and thinking very seriously about what was the best thing for democracy and how to keep things in order.
Right. So before you get to the identity crisis Democrats went through post Donald Trump's election, you spend a lot of time in the years leading up to 2016 and Donald Trump's election, particularly on the Clinton campaign. One thing I noticed from your book, which I remember from the campaign too, and post-campaign, Isaac, is that the Hillary people and Hillary herself, they're quick to blame for her defeat. They're quick to blame James Comey. They're quick to blame the Russians. They're quick to blame Bernie. They're not so quick to blame Hillary herself, right?
Yeah, and look, all of those things were factors, obviously. But there's a conversation that I recount in the book that I had with a Clinton aide. It was the Thursday before the election, so it was at 4 or 5 days. We were at a diner in Brooklyn, not far from headquarters.
Right.
And the person said, we realized this was going to be a change election, but Hillary couldn't be the change candidate. So we decided to change the question. And, I'm sure that meeting where the person said that, people are like, oh, that sounds great. But it doesn't really make any sense. And one way or the other, it didn't work, if you may have noticed. She was not. And I think that there was, in a way that at least to the extent of it, that we didn't, any of us realize, a mismatch of Hillary Clinton with that moment where people were looking for something to be different. And she was, the heir to two different presidencies, through her husband's presidency and through Barack Obama's presidency as his Secretary of State. She was also, it's always hard when one party has been in power for 2 terms to have another term for that party. It's just the way that American voters act. And there are other things in there too. There's a lot of sexism that was true in the country. And look, all of that being the case, she still won the popular vote by 2.9 million, right?
Right.
But lost it in places and in ways that were really not only kept her from being president, but were really problematic for the Democratic Party.
One big takeaway that I have from that part of your book is that you indicate, or I think you even assert, that Barack Obama was as responsible for her loss as she was. I mean, you have a phrase in there, quote, Obama ushered in what followed him.
Yeah, well, that's
explain that. That's pretty strong.
Well, I think you'll see what as you know, what I trace in the book is that you look at Obama's political involvement, and this is a man who was really not ever interested in party politics. When we go back before he's president, he runs against Bobby Rush in a House primary, a longtime incumbent, right, in Chicago. Loses. He runs as kind of the not establishment candidate, not favored candidate in the Senate race in 2004. He wins that Senate race. Ultimately, there were a lot of things that happened in that primary. It's a whole book in itself, probably.
Right.
And then he runs in 2008 for president. Of course, Hillary Clinton is the party choice, right? And he runs against her and he wins. He doesn't think in that way. But he also, as the president, is traditionally in charge of the party apparatus, right? And that was important for Trump when he picked Ronna Romney McDaniel. And Biden picking Jamie Harrison for that job. And Obama, he just never really cared. His first DNC chair pick was Tim Kaine. Kaine was finishing up as governor for the first year of that. So he was just commuting a day or two a week into Washington to be DNC chair while having a pretty important job as governor. And then after Kaine, he picks Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who he picked because he thought it would be good for his reelection campaign, because she's a woman, because she's from Florida, because she's Jewish, because she had a lot of relationship with donors. It was the best thing for his reelection campaign in his mind and the mind of his advisors, but it was not necessarily the best thing for the DNC. And by the way, Wasserman Schultz stayed DNC chair for a very long time and past the point when some Obama aides were looking to replace her. And Obama he couldn't really be brought to have the fight.
You point out the scorecard under 8 years of Barack Obama. I don't know whether you have the numbers in front of you, but I do in front of me. 947 state legislative seats lost during his 8 years, 63 House members, 11 senators, and 13 governors. Ouch, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the Democratic bench right there, right?
There it is. Yeah.
And not all of that is on him, right? There are a lot of factors that went into that. Some of it is that, they did so badly in the 2010 midterms. Again, there's usually a push against the incumbent party, the White House incumbent party in the midterms. And so that happened, and it happened in a year that was the gerrymander year, the census year, right? And so it made even more losses in the House and in state legislatures. But it was not a good period for Democrats. And I think part of what happened when Trump won, and I try to trace this in the book, is that it was devastating to Democrats in itself. It was a shocker surprise to almost everyone, including, by the way, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump. They were all surprised. But it led to a reconsideration among Democrats to look at what had happened, to look at the wreckage of the party that was there that people hadn't been really paying attention to. There was a stagnation of the party. There was a real falling apart of the party all over the country. And there's an interview that I did with Joe Biden in his office as vice president, the West Wing, a couple doors down from the Oval Office, a week before Trump's inauguration. And he was saying then, I think the Democratic Party has lost touch with what it needed to be, with what it traditionally has been. And he's going on about this. And I stopped him and I said, this sounds like a stump speech. And he said to me, well, no, it's not a stump speech. Well, maybe for someone else, but not for and of course, what the book also traces, among many other things, is that evolution for Biden, not just in getting into the race, but how he thought about the race and how he came to think about being president and the presidency that is presented to him. And, it ends with this interview. Then it was Biden's first interview as president. 2 weeks into his presidency in February, we spoke for the book. And you see a lot of that picked up and reflected.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back with Biden again, as you relate in the book, to pre-Trump's, to pre-2016, let's say 2015, was Biden seriously considering running against Hillary?
So this is
in the primary.
So he was never prepared to run in the primary. He never got a campaign together. He had written off that he was going to run for president. But part of why that had happened is because he just felt like his moment had passed. And part of it was because he had started to transfer his dream of being president to his son, Beau. And then what happens is that Beau develops this very terrible, devastating brain cancer that starts killing him very quickly. And there's no, I don't remember what the percentage chance for survival is, but it's basically once you get it, that's it. And they tried everything they could to save him and prolong his life. And he died. He died Memorial Day weekend in 2015. And when that happens, Biden goes through this period that's like, in part coping, Bill, like he's doing it he's talking about running for president so that he doesn't have to think about how horrible it is that he's lost his beloved son. And in part to carry on Beau's legacy and do it for him. And in part to give his own life meaning, right? Because remember, this is a man who lost his wife and infant daughter in 1972 in that car crash that Beau and Hunter were in. The two Biden boys, they both survived. And then there's this super tight unit of the three of them. For a couple of years, Biden is a single parent. It's sort of strange to think about, right? Not a common story, a single parent as a man in the 1970s, but that's what circumstances delivered to him. And then his life, he meets Jill Biden, and they have a daughter together. And then it hits him again with this grief, and it's overwhelming to him. And so he sort of gets close to running, sort of doesn't. People are trying to talk him out of it, including Obama. Ultimately, he doesn't run. And I think he was not ready to run at that point. And he acknowledged that eventually, that it just wasn't, he wasn't there for it.
Did Obama talk him out of it or tell him not to run?
Obama has a way, and I trace this with people, where he doesn't ever say, don't run. But he'll, I refer to it in one point in talking about a conversation he had with Pete Buttigieg right before the New Hampshire primary, where he's, in Obama's mind, he seems to think he's telling Buttigieg, that was great, but you got to start getting to a landing spot here. You won the Iowa caucuses, but come on, it's a little bit crazy. And Buttigieg did not hear that out of the conversation. And I think that in the Biden conversations, Biden maybe heard it a little bit more, what Obama was trying to do, but Biden wasn't really clicking in and listening to it in 2015. And I think that one of the things that happens is that Obama sends David Plouffe, his advisor, to meet with Biden and say to him, lay out the case for why not to run for president, right? It'll be really hard, all these things. And Plouffe can see that Biden is not clicking in on it. And finally, Plouffe says to him, remember, this is Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are running and already running strong in the fall of 2015. And he says to him, Mr. Vice President, listen, you have had an amazing career. We all love you. Do you really want all of this to end in a hotel room in Des Moines, coming in third to Bernie Sanders? And that hits Biden and helps sort of crack him into the right state of mind to say, no, I'm not going to run. And you see at the beginning of this book, when I pick up his story from there, he is still not ready to run for president then, even though he's like more ready each week that goes by as he gets over the worst of the grief about his dying. And I think you see all through 2019 in the book how much trouble he was having, how few people were showing up to his events, how he was stumbling around saying things that weren't really making sense sometimes. He wasn't connecting with crowds. And that was concerning to everybody. Part of what the book traces also is that it was concerning to Barack Obama, who wondered whether Biden would be able to pull it out.
So now to the heart of the book, which is this period between 2016 and 2020. And I want to go back to your conversation, your interview with Joe Biden in his office right down the hall from the Oval Office, where he talked about the theme. He was talking about the theme you said it sounded like a stump speech. And as I recall from the book, that's where he started using this phrase, the battle for the soul of the Democratic Party, right? He saw that post-Trump that the Democratic Party had to come to grips. What did he mean by that? Like what the party was all about? The direction of the party?
The battle for the soul comes not just with Trump. What it comes from is after Charlottesville, which is the seminal moment for Biden, right? Where he decides, he never liked Trump, obviously. I don't think he voted for Trump in 2016. He thought his politics were terrible and didn't want him to be the president. He didn't like him. He said to me in the interview that I did with him at the beginning of February, I thought he had no socially redeeming value as far as I could see, is how he put it. All of that is true. But when Charlottesville happens, he sees something deeper that is going on for the country and a need to remove Donald Trump from office. And he starts saying to people, at the beginning of 2017, he's like joking around, like, if I'm walking, I'm running, I'm not running. But by the end of 2017, what he's saying to people is, if you can convince me someone else could win, then I won't run. But Trump needs to go. And if I can't be convinced that someone else can beat him, I'm going to run against him. Now, of course, Bill, you've spent a lot of time around politicians, right? That's a kind of self-serving argument, right?
Yeah, of course.
Me, right? But I think what it turned out to be the case when you look at the election results is that you see there is at least some rationale after the fact to that argument, right? That the way that Biden won, where the votes were, how close it was in just enough states. 4 states flipped 77,000 votes. Even with a 7 million vote lead in the popular vote, Trump would have won the Electoral College. That kind of stuff, it's hard. It's hard to make the argument that someone else would have had the same results. And I'll tell you, one of the people that I quote in the book is a friend of Kamala Harris's who I spoke to after the riot happened. And I said, what do you make of all this? And this person said to me, I really wanted her to win. The campaign was so hard. It was so devastating when it didn't work out. But I thank God, basically, that she didn't win, that she wasn't the nominee, because if she had, I think she would have lost to Trump and he'd be reelected president. And then I would have had to throw myself off the Golden Gate Bridge.
So during this time, Biden, as you say, if I'm walking, I'm running, right? So leading up, looking at who might run in 2020. But now he knew there was going to be a big field of candidates and this time around, and people are starting to emerge. Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, particularly those three. What were they doing this time to get ready, and kind of what was Obama's role in all of this?
Well, look, Bill, obviously you've spent a lot of time with Bernie Sanders, and you know that there was an adjustment period for him to going from the guy who was presenting a lot of ideas to then, like, it's getting serious. Like, how do you translate this into policy and legislation, right? And the big move for Sanders was in 2017, he says, okay, we're not going to just keep talking about Medicare for all. Let's make a bill. And let's look at what it is. And they start working with other senators. And some senators are interested and some are not. He is doing it in sort of in 2 simultaneous tracks. One is because he believes that there should be Medicare for all and that there should be some way to get this to happen, despite the fact that realistically, I don't think it would ever get through the Senate. Not without major changes in the membership of the Senate, and maybe not even through the House either. So that's going on. But also, his advisors see an opportunity in Medicare for All in that they assume Sanders is probably running for president again. And they think, look, if we can get all these people who will be wanting to prove their bona fides with the progressives to sign on to Medicare for All to do that, then if he's on a primary stage with them, he wins no matter what, because he's the one who's the purist. They're all like trying to get closer to his way of doing it. And so that's what they do. But then there's this dynamic with Warren, who coming out of 2016 is actually much more the favored candidate of the liberal intelligentsia. And the Sanders folks feel like they need her stamp of approval on Medicare for All for it to pick up and be more than just a thing that Bernie Sanders is talking about. And so they court her quite a bit. And there ends up being this meeting between Sanders and Warren that I describe in the book. Warren did not support Medicare for All. She doesn't think it's the right way to go because, it seems like in part because of the same argument that holds Sherrod Brown back from backing Medicare for All, that it's an idea that actually slows down getting healthcare coverage to people because you talk about an idea that's not going to happen rather than ideas that will. And she also thinks that just the policy of Medicare for All is bad. But she goes in and she decides, she makes a political decision at that point. She's a politician too. And she knows, she can see basically the trap that Bernie Sanders is laying for her here, but she doesn't feel like she has a choice. So she signs on, I think in some ways betting that maybe Sanders won't run in 2016 or 2020 rather, and that'll save her from this being quite as big of an issue. But also, as it traced in the book, the thing that changed all of it for Sanders is Kamala Harris signs on to Medicare for All.
Number one, right?
She's the first person to sign on, first co-sponsor. She does that. Not the Sanders people are caught off guard by that. She does it because she is planning to run for president, and because she wants to have that connection to progressives, and is making a bet that Sanders won't be in the race herself. And she does that, and then all of a sudden, everybody's like, well, okay, if Kamala Harris is on, okay, I got to be on. And then I was at the press conference, I'm not sure if you covered that, but in 2017, in one of the Senate office buildings, when Medicare for All was announced, and it was so many senators were there, and including many of the people who ended up running for president, Cory Booker and Kirsten Gillibrand, right? Some of the ones who weren't there, notably Amy Klobuchar and Michael Bennet, both of whom don't support Medicare for All. And never have. But it did then work in Sanders' favor, I think, to a point, right? Medicare for All became the defining issue of the primary campaign in a way that was mind-numbing to me at points, because you'd have these primary debates where the first 35 minutes was candidates going back and forth in ways that didn't make sense to anyone about a bill that everybody knew probably couldn't even get to the floor.
Yeah. Well, no, I remember that they spent so much time in the intricacies of this Medicare for All, right? And it was mind numbing, right?
At the expense of other issues. And I will say, I don't know if they're right about this, but Elizabeth Warren's folks feel like this was an error in a lot of ways. Of course, there's something self-serving to that too. But point out, their argument is that her wealth tax idea, the 2-cent tax that she's now pushing in the Senate as not a presidential candidate, would have had a much broader appeal, both within the Democratic Party and within the country overall, where they would say, like, it's not Medicare for all, socialized, it's rich people should be paying more money, and it's even not a lot of money. And they think that would have been much more appealing politically, but that they never got to have that argument really, because it just got all wrapped up in Medicare for All, with every candidate trying to figure out how they were embracing it, with one notable exception, essentially, which was Joe Biden.
So during all of this time, everybody is taking their turn going to the mountaintop to get some advice, but really to try to get the endorsement of Barack Obama. Did he have a favorite?
No, he didn't have a favorite exactly. He had people that he was interested in. He was interested in Deval Patrick. He was interested in Mitch Landrieu. Neither of them ended up running. Deval Patrick got in much later, but his wife developed cancer, and so he didn't run on the timeline he was expecting to. And then he got interested in Beto O'Rourke. What do these people have in common? They are, like Obama sees himself, as like outside the system, right? All that stuff we were talking about, and outside of Washington, and had something to them that was lighting up interest in a way that's beyond the kind of political fare. And so Obama's into each one of them along the way. He was asked, there's a scene in the book in December 2017, Obama's on a plane with his with a couple of aides flying from Chicago. There's a holiday party for the Obama Foundation. Mm-hmm. And they're playing a game that is probably familiar to you and many Democrats. And I think many people even who weren't Democrats are like, who do you think should be the president? It's going to run. Yeah. And the way Obama frames it, he says, okay, who do you want in your head? Who do you want in your heart? And who do you think can win? And they bounce around a couple of names. And his names are, for head, Bill McRaven, the commander of the Navy SEAL raid that killed bin Laden. And he wasn't the only person who felt that way about McRaven. They was like intrigued and saw him as sort of like a Cincinnatus figure who would be, in this very partisan moment that Trump had presented, would be the post-partisan guy who could lead through it. In his heart, Obama says Biden, of course, love Biden. I'm not sure that he can do it, though, is what he basically started to say. And so the question of who could win, he was saying, I don't know. Importantly, right, he had a lot of doubts about Biden, but all those doubts were not just Barack Obama's, right? At the beginning of Biden's primary campaign, there were a lot of people who felt like Obama did, saying, maybe he's too old. Obama said at one point, I'm rusty when I get out there. God knows how rusty Joe is. And so he's expressing these doubts that were not only his, but they were definitely his as well.
Bill Press with journalist and author Edward-Isaac Dovere. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Arohi Pathak, Daron Acemoglu, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.